Business as usual is quite unusual in 2021. Some companies are busier than ever, endeavoring to keep up with demand. Others long for a return of a rush, of a full house, of the simple ability to stand shoulder to shoulder. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed the way we do business. Some of those changes may be permanent. Some may go away in the near future. Unfortunately, for now, there's a lot we don't know. The challenges are many, and not all of them can be blamed on a virus. Housing shortages, workforce gaps, inequality. A variety of social and economic issues challenged us before the pandemic reached the Lilac City. But we are Spokane. We are Coeur d'Alene. We are the Inland Northwest. We are nothing if not caring, resilient, and resourceful. At the Journal of Business, we endeavor to keep you, our readers, informed on what's happening in your community. Our staff is dedicated to providing you with objective information on news and trends, with the goal of ultimately helping you to be more successful in your chosen path. It's time to go beyond sound bites. It's time for more depth than 140 characters can provide. It's time for elevating the conversation.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to Elevating the Conversation. My name is Paul Reed and it is my honor to serve as publisher of the Journal of Business. I'm thrilled that more than 275 of you have chosen to spend this time this afternoon for what I would call a very important discussion. We launched this series because you asked us for a venue in which we could have conversations about important issues in our community. In January, we welcomed Spokane Public Facilities District CEO Stephanie Curran to talk about the hospitality industry in this inhospitable world of COVID. In February, we brought in Dr. Frank Velazquez, interim health officer for the Spokane Regional Health District, to talk about vaccines and the road ahead. Last month, we were very pleased to have Keonta Duncan, president of the local NAACP, for a conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion in a mostly white community. And in May, we have Washington Trust economist Steve Scranton for a mid-year report and conversation about what a post-pandemic economy might look like. We have many more coming up the rest of the year. We hope you join us. But today, I'm very honored to have with us Jim Frank, founder of Greenstone Homes, for a discussion about affordability and availability in the very tight housing market, arguably a market in crisis. This topic is one that has impacts on all of us and can have profound effects on the future of our community. It's an issue with complex nuances and one that deserves more attention and dialogue, and that's why we're here. But before we get to that, first I'd like to thank this month's sponsor of Elevating the Conversation. We simply don't get to do these kinds of things without the great support of great companies in this community. This month, that sponsor is STCU. And we're very appreciative that they had helped make this possible. Thank you, STCU. And with us today to say a few words is STCU CEO, Ezra Eckhart. Welcome, Ezra.
Hello, I'm Ezra Eckhart, the president and CEO of STCU, and we are very happy to be able to sponsor today's Journal of Business, Elevating the Conversation. The topic is on affordable housing and availability. This is a really important topic for our community. At last count, we're somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 units short of affordable housing here in the Metro Spokane area. And housing is a critical part of our environment. It provides more than shelter. It's an ability for families to collect wealth, to have a safe place to raise their family, a comfortable place for them to build community, and the right way to develop children and better the long-term interests of our community overall. So when we think about your ability to help sponsor hopes and dreams in the community, it all comes down to affordable housing. This is a concerted effort that's going to take effort on the part of the government, not-for-profit agencies, private businesses, and we need to find solutions to be able to deliver those 8,000 to 10,000 units over the course of the next several years. At STCU, we found a way to partner with Habitat and have been able to sponsor the build for 8 houses. And that's just a drop in the bucket of what our community needs overall. So we're looking forward to finding great solutions for other credit unions and financial institutions to be a part of the conversation. And today, the Journal of Business is bringing forward Jim Frank to lead the discussion, and hopefully we can find some creative opportunities where we can partner together. So at STCU, we're here for good. We want to support our community in moving forward, and we're happy to be a part of today's Journal of Business event.
Welcome to Elevating the Conversation. My name is Lynn Parrish. I'm the editor of the Journal of Business and your host for the next 45 minutes to 60 minutes. We'll see how it goes. Joining us today is Jim Frank, founder of Greenstone Homes. Happy to have Jim with us from an undisclosed location somewhere in Zoomland. Welcome, Jim.
Hi, Lynn. Thank you. Thank you, and thank STCU for the opportunity to share some thoughts on an important subject.
It is an important subject, and we have a lot of ground to cover today. I don't know if we can do it in 30 minutes, so let's dive in and see how far we can get. I think everybody knows the basics. We have low inventory, we have high prices, rising prices for housing. And I'd like to start by just asking, what are some of the primary causes of the housing shortage that we have right now?
Well, I think the problems go back maybe 50 years. It's been a long road to the housing kind of crisis that we have today, and there's been just a history of restrictions on the ability to build the number of houses we need and where we need them. So it's a complicated problem. When you talk about a problem that's evolved over time, I call it 1,000 points of light. There are just a lot of small issues that need to be dealt with, and they just need to be dealt with one at a time, and progress needs to move forward. But it's challenged because the problems are very complicated.
Well, let's start with growth management. Talk a little bit about growth management. I'll tell you, historically, the Journal has been in support of growth management, the concept of doing something to control sprawl. We've been critical at times of the nuances or some of the approaches. Where are you on growth management at this time?
Well, I think everyone's in favor of growth management and in favor of the general principles of growth management, trying to encourage more infill and trying to discourage the unnecessary kind of sprawling suburban development. But to say that is one thing, and to implement it is another. And I think what's happened in Spokane is we've implemented a very tight boundary, growth management boundary, within which all development was supposed to have occurred. But then we didn't enable the kind of infill development that we want to see happen. So the development regulations of most of the jurisdictions in Spokane County just simply don't encourage infill development, and they've made infill development very, very difficult. And the result of that has been that we haven't built as many houses as we should have. And we've actually had the unintended consequence of driving a lot of development into North Idaho. So North Idaho has, over the last 10 years, accumulated a much larger share of the urban new housing construction than would be justified by their population base. And that's just really a result of us not implementing the growth management policies in an effective way.
Sure. I know you have an infill development that your company is working on right now on the South Hill. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that's going?
Yeah, that project's called Garden District, and it's on about 25 acres, and it's located in an infill site near Southeast Boulevard and 29th, and it's actually directly across the street, really, from the Lincoln Heights Shopping Center. And it's in an area that the city has designated as a center. So under the city's comprehensive plan, they want to encourage higher density residential development around centers. But the city's development regulations actually restricted our ability to do small houses on small lots. And that's the challenging thing, is the goals are there in the comp plan. The vision is there for what we want to have happen, but the development regulations are so restrictive, and they never were intended for urban development. So we have a suburban development code really in the city of Spokane, and that suburban development code has not been updated for a couple of decades. And there's been a patchwork of little patches put on it. And the patches have actually, in many cases made things worse. I can just give you a simple example. The code has a lot size transition rule. And what that means is that they want the lots that you develop in an infill environment to be the same size as all the lots that surround that infill parcel. Well, the problem with that in our particular case was there were a lot of old historic 1960s lots there that were like 10,000 square feet. And in today's environment, if you're going to build on a lot that large, you're going to build a $500,000 house or more. You're not going to build affordable infill homes. And so we were forced into using large lots instead of small lots. Like in Kendall Yards, for example, we've done a lot of what we call cottage lots. They're about 3,000 square feet in size. And we can do a small 1,200 to 1,400 square foot house, 2 or 3 bedroom, 2 bath. The kind of starter home, the kind of infill home you'd like to see be able to be developed in an environment like this. But the code really mandates that the lots be larger. And when you make the lots larger, the lot prices go up, and the houses you build will be much more expensive. So that's just one example of the kind of development restriction that's inhibiting our ability to provide the kind of housing that we want in our community.
So what was the net effect in that neighborhood in terms of number of lots that you wanted to develop on that acreage compared to the number of lots that you're developing now?
Well, it roughly cut the project includes both multifamily and single family, but on the single family side, it cut the density about in half. But the lot size transition rules required lots that were over 7,000 square feet. And we could have developed cottages on lots that would have been 3,500 square feet or smaller. So it has a significant effect. And it's just, for me, that's low hanging fruit. That's a code provision that should be eliminated. It should have been eliminated years ago. The challenge is that there's education that needs to take place with homeowners, because when the city includes a provision like that in their zoning code, they send a message to the community that we're trying to protect you from poor development. And poor development would be smaller lots around your house. Therefore, we're protecting you from that. Now, that's not true. That's not what the goals of the comp plan are, and it's not factually accurate. But it creates you send a message to people that that's what's going to happen, and so we need to do a much better job of educating people about the objectives of growth management and the kind of development regulations we need, and a real understanding of the impact that they have in their neighborhoods.
Sure. I'm glad you brought up Kendall Yards earlier, because I think that is the kind of project that people look at as something that we need more of in our community. What enabled you to do with, and let me expand on that just a little bit, because it's the mix of residential and commercial. sometimes in the same buildings, a mix of products ranging from rentals to the cottages you referred to full townhomes, and a number of price points. So what enabled you to do that project and prohibits you from doing something like that at the Garden District?
We're operating at Kendall Yards under a planned unit development approval that was granted before 2006. And under the old PUD ordinance, you were allowed to get significant deviations from the development code as part of a planned project. And then those deviations in that project review went through the Plan Commission, ultimately went also through the City Council. But the city stripped away the benefits of the PUD ordinance in a revision to the code that was done in 2006. Nearly all the benefits of doing a PUD were stripped away. So for example, they took away the ability to do commercial development within a residential zone. So at Kendall Yards, for example, at Nettleton, near the Centennial Trail and Olmsted Park, we have a small little retail area there. And that retail area is really a thriving little spot in the neighborhood. It allows people that live in the neighborhood to gather, to meet with each other. It helps create social fabric within the neighborhood. That is no longer allowed in the city in a residential zone, and you can't use the PUD to get an exemption from that requirement any longer. So again, that's one of the things that needs to change. There needs to be a pathway for that kind of development. Because look, people want to be able to live in a neighborhood where they're within walking distance of services. And one of the goals of growth management is to get rid of this idea that single family houses are over here and commercial is over here and multifamily is back here, and they're all separated from each other. The only way you can move from one zone to another is drive your car. And that needs to be eliminated. And that's what the comprehensive plan in the city hopes to achieve. But then the tools to accomplish that were never present.
So well-meaning, but not executable at this point.
Not executable.
Our time's going quickly. I just want to remind everybody we have a question and answer segment here at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to see a box to put in questions. Please ask any questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can here in about 10 minutes. Jim, one of the things that I was curious about is we see an awful lot of apartment development going on in our community right now, and not a lot of condominium development. And I was wondering if you could go into the reasons behind that.
Well, there used to be a lot of condominiums developed in Spokane, and we, if you drive around town, you can see the history of that condominium development. And in 2009, the state of Washington amended the Condominium Act. And it was a response to some moisture problems that occurred in the Seattle West Side on some large high-rise condominiums where water penetrated into the buildings, causing damage. And as a result of that, as what I'll call a consumer protection measure, the state imposed a number of restrictions on condominium development. Those restrictions, while again well-intended, I think, went so far that they ended up prohibiting condominium development in Spokane County. And we haven't had a condominium project developed in Spokane County in more than 10 years. And so there's been work done to try to remove some of those barriers that have been unsuccessful in the last 2 or 3 legislative sessions. So if you go to North Idaho, for example, you go to downtown Coeur d'Alene, you see 3 or 4 high-rise condominium projects. Sure. And then if you go out to some of the inner neighborhoods, you see small townhouse and condominium projects being developed, within urban neighborhoods surrounding downtown. And even in some of the suburban neighborhoods, we're developing some condominiums in small infill type buildings, 6-unit buildings, for example, where you can do condominiums of 1,000 to 1,200 square feet, 2 and 3 bedroom units, and you can price those at a very affordable price. But that kind of condominium development is not possible in the state of Washington now. And it's a significant issue because the barrier, there needs to be an entry point for young families to enter the ladder of home ownership. And when you remove condominium development, you remove one of the lower steps on the ladder that enable people to enter the home ownership system and then be able to move up as time goes on. So if you can't build small houses on small lots, if you can't build townhouses in single family neighborhoods, if you can't build small multifamily units or as condominiums, then you've restricted the ability of affordable homes to be constructed, and you've restricted the ability of families to enter onto the ladder of home ownership. And that's really what we're seeing in Spokane, and that's the heart of the problem. And most of the houses that we're building today are very expensive houses. And that isn't because companies like Greenstone and other home builders want to do that. That's all we want to do is build expensive houses. That's not true. It's the only thing that we're allowed to build are large, expensive houses. And that's why that's happening. Because essentially, builders and developers like ourselves, we do what the development code allows us to do. That's the history of real estate development. You do what you're allowed to do. And small infill development is neither allowed nor encouraged.
I want to talk about solutions shortly, but before we get to that, are there any other hurdles to developing affordable housing that you'd like to talk about today?
Well, I mean, it's the other challenge that this market has today is just supply chain and labor shortages. Sure. Because the demand for housing is so high, we do have supply chain issues on lumber, for example. You see lumber prices skyrocketing. We had some people that supply bathroom fixtures say that certain bathroom fixtures had a lead time of almost a year. It's very difficult for subcontractors to find tradespeople to work in the trades. That's a result really of us for a generation telling young people that they shouldn't go into the trades. You should go get a 4-year college education. So we discouraged young people from a trade education and going into the trades as a career. And in some instances, subcontractors are having to pay what I'll call signing bonuses to get electricians and plumbers and heavy equipment operators to come to work for them, actually paying them a signing bonus to do it. So that is layered on top of the regulatory issues, the land availability issues.
Sure. So let's talk solutions real quick. You mentioned one modification being low-hanging fruit. Is there any other low-hanging fruit out there of things we could do to increase the amount of housing that we're building, specifically homes for people to buy?
Well, I think we need we've talked a lot about the problems, the housing problems in Spokane. The city's had a housing action plan that they've been working on for almost a year. I really feel that it's time that the time for talking about this problem is over. I think we understand pretty clearly what the problems are, and we do need to begin a process of change. We need to slowly but methodically look at the development code and make the changes that need to be made. And those include things like modifying the PUD ordinance, so there's a pathway for urban infill development where code deviations are required. That pathway needs to exist. There needs to be changes in the development code that allow a wider range of housing in every zone. So for example, in the single family zone, you should be able to build townhouses. I feel that housing should be regulated in a zone by building height and by density. So in the single family zone, you should be limited to 2 stories, and you should be limited to the 10 units an acre, which is in the development code for the single family zone. So as long as you're building less than 2 stories, as long as you're building less than 10 units an acre, then you should be able to use a variety of housing types. Maybe that's a single family detached house. Maybe it's a single family attached house. Maybe it's a townhome. Maybe it's a small condominium project. But there needs to be a wider range of housing types and a wider range of economic and social diversity permitted within all of our zones, including the single family zone. So that's an important consideration.
Thanks, Jim. Boy, our time's really going fast. Are you ready to get to some questions?
Sure.
I think we're getting quite a few, so I'll just start chipping away at them. Starting at the top with Carl Otterstrom. Hi, Carl. How are you doing? Carl asks, of all the changes local jurisdictions could make to enable more infill housing, what action should come first? For instance, change to minimum lot size, ADU compliance, or excuse me, ADU allowance, eliminate single family zones like Minneapolis did, or more flexible PUD provisions of the code. His basic question is, what action should come first?
Yeah. Well, I think the most effective thing that we could do is to allow as I just discussed, allow a wider range of housing types in every zone, from the low density residential zone up to the high density residential zone. We need to allow a wider range of housing types within each zone. Right now, now we're segregating all of these housing uses. So all of the detached single family houses, they're in one zone, and all the multifamily housing, it's all in another zone. And honestly, people hate it. People hate it when they drive down the street and see 200 unit multifamily projects everywhere. There's no reason why we're not building smaller multifamily projects, but we need to provide the opportunity to do that in a wider range of zones than just the high density residential zone. Otherwise, you're not going to break that pattern. So I think that's the best thing we can do. Minneapolis, Portland, a lot of other cities across the country have looked at a wider range of housing uses within all of the residential zones. And I think that's the most effective thing that we could do.
Interesting. Thanks for the question, Carl. Next one is from Lars Gilbert. Good afternoon, Lars. What are the costs created from new energy efficiency standards, and how does that play out for homeowners in terms of costs and benefits? Great question.
Yeah, it is a good question. And the state just implemented a revision to the state energy code. And we already had one of the most, I'll call it challenging energy codes in the country. And and it became a bit more challenging for builders and developers. I personally like the code. I think there's a lot of good that comes from it, and it allows us to deal with a lot of the environmental and climate change issues that we're facing. But it does add cost. It adds, it adds $10,000 or more to the cost of a single family home. There's different ways of approaching a solution to energy savings in a house. As a company, we've decided that we're putting solar arrays on every new house we build now. So the solar arrays are one way of dealing and meeting the standards in the energy code, in addition to work on the envelope and better insulation and so forth. But sometimes when you put better insulation in the house, the customer doesn't understand the benefit of it and doesn't see it. The thing about a solar array is the customer sees it. And so that understanding of it allows a willingness to pay more for it. And of course, all of it is reducing their long-term energy bills and creating a more sustainable, resilient kind of product. So we like it from that standpoint, but it is expensive. And so you have to look for solutions that customers can appreciate and understand.
I don't know if you've looked at this, just playing off of Lars's question real quick. I don't know if you've looked at this, but have you figured how long it takes to get that investment in energy saving measures back in saved utility costs? Have you guys studied that at all at Greenstone?
Yeah, a lot of it depends on, there have been some subsidies, for example, there's been some tax credits and so forth that have been allowed for solar energy installations. And there's been buyback provisions, a higher price, Vista will pay a higher price for the power generated and so forth. So it depends a little bit on the mix of those incentives that exist. But we feel like there is an economic return, a reasonable economic return for the money that's spent on energy efficiency in a house. It adds to the purchase price, but the long-term savings in energy in the environmental benefits are justified. That's our view.
Great. Next question is from Greg Francis. Greg asks, if single-family zones allow duplexes, triplexes, and small-scale apartments, would developers do infill development on small lots? Is there a sufficient return on investment on those project types?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes. We had a consultant from Vancouver, BC come in and do a peer review on the Kendall Yards project for us. And he made a very interesting point. He said, the regulatory system needs to do more than permit the use. It needs to encourage it. And so there are a lot of things that can be done to encourage that kind of infill development. And one of the things that Seattle has done, for example, with their ADUs, and ADUs are a way of allowing a greater range of uses within a residential zone.
And just for those who may not know, ADU stands for accessory dwelling unit. Is that correct?
Accessory dwelling unit. So it allows you to build an additional living unit on your lot that has a kitchen in it. So that enables you to have someone, you can rent it out, or you could have a family member use it, or and so forth. But what Seattle has done and Portland has done as well is they've actually pre-approved the design of a number of plans, so that if a person wants to build one, they can just go to the city, they can pick out an approved plan. It's already been pre-approved by the building department, and they can just get a building permit and move ahead. And so that encourages that kind of development. But there's a lot going on that discourages infill development right now. Even the permit fee structure, for example, if you have a large lot and you wanted to do 2 townhouses on it, so you need 2 parcels, you need 2 land parcels, that's called a short plat. The cost of doing a short plat is prohibitive. I mean, it's almost $10,000 in permit fees to do a short plat. Well, you're never going to have people doing a short plat if you're going to charge them $10,000. Now, you'll have a handful, but you can't encourage infill development unless you remove all of these barriers. I work with a lot of small builders who want to go into neighborhoods like West Central, and they want to be able to build on some of the vacant lots in there. And so do programs like Habitat. I mean, Habitat's done a good job of trying to use infill development lots, but they face the same restrictions that for-profit builders do. There's just too many barriers in the way. And so you have to do more than just permit it. You have to remove the barriers in a way that encourage the use. I believe that the private sector will respond when with the proper, development code in place.
Very good. Greg, thanks for the question. Next one is from Edie Christman. Edie says, thanks for this and all you do to advocate for affordable housing. What do you think are the best mechanisms to address NIMBYism? So not in my backyard-ism.
I think there's 2 important things. One is education. And we went through that education process on our Garden District project on the South Hill. The first meeting we had with the public on that project, there were 150 people in a meeting room, and they didn't care what we were doing. They didn't want it. And there wasn't a single person in that room that was going to support what they didn't actually know what we were going to do, but they weren't in favor of it.
Sure.
And that's just out of what I know to be the normal fear of an unknown situation from families that are trying to protect the biggest asset that they own, their family home. And so it's normal and expected. But after some time, took 2 or 3 months, meeting people in cafes and in kitchens and at meetings and so forth, we were able to talk them through the issues and choices that existed. And at the end, almost literally to a person, they came on board and supported what we were trying to do. And we found that we had much more in common with the neighborhood than we had disagreements on. So education is one thing. The other thing is that we need to be careful when we create permits and hearings for everything. Some things, if something is permitted by right, then people come to understand that that's permitted by the code, and I don't really have any say about it. And so they accept it. But when you say to someone, well, you can't do that without getting a permit, then the message that you send to the public is that, well, that person's asking for some special favor. If they have to have a hearing and get a special permit for what they're doing, then they must be asking for something special. And that gives me a right to comment and oppose it. And so that's a big part of the problem, is that we've created a much too complex set of regulatory requirements on things, and they need to be either permitted or not permitted. And the exceptions for something like, say, a PUD need to be the exception, not the rule. But unfortunately, whether you're doing an ADU, whether you're doing using the cottage ordinance, all of these require special permits. And whenever you are forced to get a special permit, the public thinks they have a right to comment. And it's not that I don't want the public to comment on things, but you can't, you're misleading the public on the consequences of these actions when you require permit for things that should be outright. They should be an outright permitted use. And if you meet the building code, you should be able to move forward. And so we've made the process far too complicated.
Sure, that makes perfect sense. Let's see, the next question I have is from Rachel Granrath. It says, what specific code amendments or policies would be most beneficial to penciling out mixed use and a diversity of housing options in the Spokane region? We talked about ADUs a little bit. Anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I think her question is maybe the one that I answered earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, we just need to allow a wider range of housing uses in every zone. And there needs to be a pathway through, say, a PUD ordinance that permits commercial uses, small retail uses in every zone as well. And honestly, we're doing a neighborhood out in Liberty Lake where we're doing a small retail development in the middle of a residential neighborhood. And people see that and they fall in love with it and they want to live as close to that retail cluster as they can. I've had people call me and say, I'm desperate to live in that neighborhood close to that small little retail area. I like the idea of walking 2 blocks to a coffee shop. And so we need to move away from the idea that mixing uses at a fine scale within a neighborhood is somehow detrimental. And we're sending that message through the code that these things are detrimental when they're not detrimental. And I think people generally understand that. In a way, it's just going back to developing neighborhoods before we had planning departments. You know, if you go back to neighborhoods that were built before 1950, and some of our nicest neighborhoods in Spokane are those neighborhoods. And if you look at those neighborhoods, the near north side, the lower South Hill, they're full of a mix and diversity of housing and commercial uses on a fine scale. And we need to go back to where we came from. And that really is what drives me, because I grew up in the Corbin Park neighborhood, and I experienced this growing up. The diversity in my neighborhood of housing, the diversity of the economic diversity between families, and the walkability of the neighborhood, I experienced it. And so it's what's really, driven our company in many ways to try to understand that and try to look forward in a way that enables those kinds of neighborhoods to be constructed again.
That's great. So you mentioned before people who are concerned about a project that's coming being protective of their largest investment, which for many people is their home. And that makes a lot of sense. Is the code, the way it's written now, is part of it to preserve that value or at least intended to preserve that value?
Well, I think we want a development code that that protects the value of neighborhoods, but we also have to understand the reality that mixing uses at a fine scale and creating walkability within a neighborhood does not negatively affect the value of a home. And that's where the problem is that we're telling people by these code provisions that these are bad things to happen in your neighborhood when they're really not bad things to happen in your neighborhood. And we need to educate people about the value of these things in the neighborhood and how it's going to improve their lives, improve their lives in many ways, not only the value of their property, but the quality of life that they have within their neighborhood will improve. And we just send the wrong messages to people, and really it's disinformation. It's not information. And so much of it is conveyed through the code itself. That disinformation is conveyed by the code itself.
I just wonder if that idea of what's of value in a neighborhood has changed over the decades to where maybe when the code was written, that was the values of the time, whereas it's evolved since then.
I mean, I do think that's true. In the 60s and 70s, the idea was you need a house on a quarter-acre lot and a big backyard, and that's what a lot of people are looking for. And so we wrote a code around that. We wrote a code, for example, that says that you can only build a house on a lot if you have frontage on a public street. And the reason it requires frontage on a public street is so you can drive your car into the garage that's on the front of the house. That's why that requirement is in the code. But in an urban situation where the house might be built on an alley, or the houses might be clustered around an open space, there's no sense to having a code requirement that says your house has to have frontage on a public street. In Kendall Yards, we have a lot of little cottages that face a common area, a little park area. They don't face a street. And it's because the car enters off the alley. But the code doesn't allow that. The code requires that you have frontage on a public street. And that's the kind of thing that historically is rooted in a suburban development code and just has not adapted to modern concepts of growth management and modern desire for people to live in a more walkable, compact environment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, we have a lot more questions, but we're also running a little bit short on time. So I'm going to ask two more and see. And then, well, if you'd be okay with this, Jim, what we'll do is we'll take two more here, and then I can forward you the rest of them if you'd be receptive to that, and answer them, and then I could get them back to the folks that asked, if that works for you.
Sure, I'm happy to take the questions and provide a written answer. Happy to.
Great. Let's see. Christopher Savage asks, with neighborhoods that have little infrastructure for walking, how do we address those problems to increase neighborhood walkability?
So we have to, we've looked at streets as the only purpose for them is to drive and park cars on. And so we've ignored in a lot of cases historically the importance of pedestrian movement on streets. So one of the things you can do, and we did this on Crestline Street as part of the Garden District project, we took Crestline Street from 37th to 32nd Street. That was a normal, traditional 36-foot wide street, and no sidewalks. And we narrowed the street down to 27 feet. So we narrowed it from 36 feet to 27 feet. And then we added a 6-foot planting strip and a sidewalk, and a 6-foot sidewalk on the side. It turned what was a very cold street where traffic traveled very fast to what I feel like is a very pleasant street, and that now has a sidewalk and now has trees planted separating the sidewalk from the street. And we can do that on so many of our streets, that streets can be narrowed. And the benefit of that narrowing is improving the pedestrian environment, and it's calming traffic within that neighborhood. Both are things that are very beneficial.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks, Chris, for the question. Let's end with Stephanie Watson. Stephanie asks, well, she says, we need to preserve native land and forests, farmland, grow food and support biodiversity and native pollinators. So her question is, where in Spokane Valley, Liberty Lake is best suited to build up for multi-use housing? She says to build up for multi-use housing. So where in the region would be the best places for that? Well, and I think the context is while keeping in mind the preservation of these other types of uses that are essential.
Well, I mean, in a way, I think it's everywhere within the urban growth boundary. I mean, the idea of an urban growth boundary is that you don't encroach on farmland, you don't encroach on prime forestry land, and you identify the lands that are best suited for urban development, and then you develop those lands at an urban density. So I think that that's the goal. And if that process works right, then you choose land that's best for development that minimizes the environmental impacts on forestry and farming and so forth. But what that requires is that you build it higher than suburban densities. So if the normal suburb is built at, say, 3 or 4 units an acre, and that's typically what you would see in areas like the Upper South Hill or 5 Mile Prairie or Indian Trail Road, you'd see densities that are in that range of 3 to 4 units an acre. We need neighborhoods that are developed at 6 to 10 units an acre. And in order to get that 6 to 10 units an acre, we need to allow this wider range of housing. We need to allow smaller houses on smaller lots. We need to allow townhouses. We need to allow small condominiums and so forth. And the more we allow that, the more we enable us to create more density within our existing neighborhoods. It reduces the pressure to expand the urban growth boundary.
Well, that's fantastic. Jim, this was everything that I was hoping it would be. Thank you for agreeing to participate today. It's been helpful to me, and I'm sure to our listeners. Thank you to everybody who asked questions. Timothy, Olivia, Natalie, I'm sorry we didn't get to yours, and the others, of course. Like I said, we'll try to get those answers to you in the next few weeks. Thanks also to STCU, Ezra, Kristen Piscopo, and their entire team for sponsoring our event today. And I would like to throw out another shout out to Erica Bullock, who is our in-house Zoom coordinator. That's an informal title, but you are allowed to put it on LinkedIn, Erica. Thanks for helping everything go smoothly today, and thanks to all of you for tuning in.